The oxygen masks dropped like prophetic warnings, and in that moment, Helen Spencer realized the man whose shoulder she'd been sleeping on, the quiet stranger with grief-worn hands, was the only person saving all the passengers by flying a malfunctioning Boeing 787. But why did she feel that his eyes hold a fury, as if he were searching for something that had been buried years ago? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The gate agent's voice crackled through Terminal C with practiced efficiency, announcing the final boarding call for Flight 429 to Denver. Helen Spencer stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching ground crews load the last cargo containers into the belly of the aircraft. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her. Executive blazer tailored to perfection, dark hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes carrying the weight of 3 sleepless weeks. She had been CEO of Skyward Airlines for exactly 21 days. 21 days of boardroom battles, media scrutiny, and late-night emergency calls about fuel costs, union disputes, and safety audits she didn't yet fully understand. At 42, she was the youngest person, and only the second woman, ever to lead the airline. The press called her a visionary. The board called her a calculated risk. Her ex-husband, in their final conversation, had called her emotionally unavailable. Helen adjusted the leather strap of her briefcase and moved toward the boarding line. Business class. Seat 3A. She'd flown this route hundreds of times as VP of Operations, but never as the woman whose signature now appeared on every policy, every decision, every consequence. Behind her, in the economy boarding line, stood Malcolm Cohen, 38, single father, former Air Force pilot, current maintenance worker at Denver International Airport. His backpack was worn at the edges, stuffed with a small teddy bear, a folded American flag, and a single white rose wrapped carefully in tissue paper. His daughter's bear, his wife's flag. The rose for a grave he visited twice a year, on the anniversary of the crash and on what would have been their wedding anniversary. Malcolm's hands, calloused from years of manual labor, gripped the boarding pass like it might dissolve. He hated flying. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had logged over 2,000 flight hours, who had once commanded fighter jets through hostile skies, now felt his chest tighten every time he stepped onto a commercial aircraft. The memories came in fragments: engine failure, alarms, screaming, his wife's last text message sent from this very airline 5 years ago. "Turbulence is bad. I love you. Kiss Emma for me." She never made it home. Helen settled into her leather seat, pulled out her laptop, and immediately buried herself in quarterly reports. Numbers soothed her. Profit margins, load factors, on-time performance percentages. These she could control. Human grief, loss, the messy variables of emotion, those she had learned to compartmentalize. The flight attendant approached with champagne. Helen waved it away without looking up. Malcolm found his seat, 3B, the middle seat of the emergency exit row. He stowed his backpack carefully overhead, sat down, and immediately closed his eyes. Breathing exercises. 4 counts in. Hold. 6 counts out. His therapist's voice echoed in his mind. "The panic attacks are your body's way of protecting you from perceived danger. You're not in danger, Malcolm. You're healing." But healing felt like betrayal when the woman you loved was still 6 feet underground. The seat beside him shifted. Helen, having finished her work, had moved from 3A to 3C, hoping for more room to spread out her files. She didn't notice the man beside her, didn't see the way his jaw clenched when the engines powered up, didn't register the slight tremor in his hands as the aircraft began to taxi. The plane lifted smoothly into the evening sky. Denver waited 2 hours ahead. Helen worked for 20 minutes, then felt the fatigue hit her like a physical weight. 3 hours of sleep in 2 days. She closed her laptop, reclined her seat slightly, and told herself she'd rest her eyes for just a moment. She didn't mean to fall asleep. She certainly didn't mean to drift sideways, her head finding the solid warmth of Malcolm's shoulder. He stiffened at first, glanced down at the woman now resting against him, her face relaxed in sleep. The hard lines of executive authority softened into something almost vulnerable. He thought about waking her. Didn't. Instead, he sat very still, surprised by the strange comfort of another human being this close, even a stranger. For the first time in 5 years, Malcolm felt something other than grief. Just presence, just the quiet weight of someone else's exhaustion matching his own. But neither of them knew that in exactly 43 minutes, everything would change, and the carefully buried secrets they each carried would collide with devastating force. The turbulence began as a whisper, a slight shudder in the airframe, the kind experienced passengers barely notice. Malcolm noticed. His eyes opened. His body, trained by thousands of hours in cockpits, registered the vibration pattern immediately. Something wasn't right. Helen stirred against his shoulder but didn't wake. Her breathing remained steady, peaceful. Malcolm glanced out the window. The wing looked normal. No visible damage. The engines hummed their usual song. But the vibration continued, a subtle discord in the symphony of flight. In the cockpit, Captain Teresa Doyle frowned at her instruments. "Are you seeing this?" she asked her first officer. "Hydraulic pressure fluctuation in System B," he replied, tapping the gauge. "Probably a sensor issue. Running diagnostics now." It wasn't a sensor issue. 5 years earlier, during Helen's tenure as VP of Operations, Skyward Airlines had faced a crisis. Maintenance costs were hemorrhaging profits. The board demanded cuts. Helen, then ambitious and eager to prove herself, had approved a contract with a third-party parts supplier. The savings were significant. The parts were certified. The paperwork was impeccable. What she didn't know, what nobody knew until much later, was that the supplier had been substituting counterfeit hydraulic components. Parts that looked identical to the originals, but were manufactured with substandard materials. Parts that could fail catastrophically under stress. And Flight 862, Helen Cohen's flight, had been equipped with those parts. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. Helen's eyes opened. She blinked, realized she was pressed against a stranger's shoulder, and sat up quickly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "I didn't mean to—" The plane dropped. Not a gentle descent. A sudden, sickening plunge that sent overhead bins rattling and passengers gasping. Helen's laptop slid off her tray table. Malcolm's hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. The seatbelt sign chimed urgently. The captain's voice, attempting calm, crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, secure the cabin." Helen's executive training kicked in immediately. She looked around, assessing. Passengers were frightened, but not panicking. Yet. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, their faces carefully neutral. She pulled out her phone. No signal at this altitude. She needed information. As CEO, she had emergency contacts, direct lines to operations, but nothing worked without connectivity. Beside her, Malcolm sat perfectly still. His breathing had changed, controlled, measured. His eyes were tracking details, the angle of the wings, the sound of the engines, the rhythm of the turbulence. This wasn't his first emergency. "You're not afraid," Helen said, more observation than question. Malcolm turned to her. His eyes, she noticed for the first time, were a deep gray, storm-colored and distant. "Fear doesn't help," he said simply. Another violent shudder. This time, the oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, yellow plastic swinging like condemned prisoners. Passengers screamed. A child began crying. The cabin pressure had dropped. Helen's hands moved automatically, securing her mask. She glanced at Malcolm. He had his mask on, but his attention was fixed on the cockpit door. He was listening, not to the screams, to something else. The pitch of the engines, the angle of descent, the hydraulic whine that only someone trained would recognize. In the cockpit, Captain Doyle was no longer calm. Complete hydraulic failure. Systems A, B, and C are all showing red. We're losing control authority. The first officer's voice was tight, declaring emergency. Denver ATC, Skyward 429. We have multiple system failures. Requesting immediate vectors for emergency landing. 429, Denver Center. Nearest suitable airport is Grand Junction Regional, bearing 270, 80 miles. Can you make it? Captain Doyle looked at her instruments. The control yoke felt loose, unresponsive. They were descending at 1,200 feet per minute. At this rate, they'd hit the Rockies long before reaching any airport. Negative, she said quietly. We're going down. But what the captain didn't know was that seated in row 3 was a man who had once landed a crippled F-16 with one engine and half a tail section. The cabin had descended into controlled chaos. Passengers gripped armrests, prayed aloud, sent final text messages to loved ones while they still had fragmented signal. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with remarkable composure, checking masks, offering reassurance that felt increasingly hollow. Helen's mind raced through protocols, emergency response procedures, media statements, liability assessments. Then she stopped herself. These people weren't numbers in a quarterly report. They were human beings, terrified, mortal. She glanced at Malcolm. He had removed his oxygen mask, was leaning into the aisle, his entire body coiled with tension. Not fear. Purpose. You need to keep that on, Helen said sharply, CEO voice activating automatically. Malcolm ignored her. He was listening to the cockpit door, to the muffled voices beyond, to the desperate radio chatter leaking through the sealed barrier. Something's wrong with the hydraulics, he said, not to Helen, to himself. They've lost control authority. They're trying to use engine thrust for directional control, but at this descent rate, he stopped, jaw tightening. Helen stared at him. How do you know that? Malcolm turned to face her fully for the first time, really looked at her. Expensive clothes, manicured hands, the kind of confidence that came from boardrooms, not battlefields, authority without experience. I flew for 12 years, he said quietly. Air Force, fighter jets mostly, then transport. I know the sound of an aircraft dying. The plane shuddered violently, tilting at a sickening angle. Screams erupted. Helen's briefcase slid across the floor. Malcolm's backpack shifted overhead, and he reached up instinctively to steady it, the gesture protective, almost tender. If you flew, why are you? Helen began, but Malcolm was already moving. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and headed toward the cockpit. A flight attendant, a young woman with red-rimmed eyes trying desperately to maintain composure, blocked his path. Sir, you need to return to your seat. I need to speak to the captain, Malcolm said, his voice carrying a command that made the attendant hesitate. That's not possible. Sir, please, I'm a pilot, Malcolm said. I can help. The attendant looked uncertain. Protocol said no unauthorized personnel in the cockpit, especially during an emergency. But protocol also said they shouldn't be spiraling toward the Rockies with complete hydraulic failure. Helen had followed Malcolm into the aisle. Let him through, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The flight attendant turned, confused. Helen pulled out her phone, showed her lock screen. The Skyward Airlines executive ID she'd set as her wallpaper out of some misguided sense of dedication. I'm Helen Spencer, CEO of Skyward. Let him through. The attendant's eyes widened. She stepped aside. Malcolm moved quickly to the cockpit door, knocked in a specific pattern, 3 sharp raps. Pause. 2 more. Military signal. The door cracked open. A flight attendant inside, pressed against the back wall, her face pale. Malcolm pushed through. Captain Doyle turned, startled, angry. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who can help," Malcolm said. He scanned the instrument panel in seconds. Hydraulic pressure gauges, all showing 0. Flight controls, unresponsive. Altitude, 14,000 feet and dropping. Terrain warning, active. "You need to leave this cockpit immediately," Captain Doyle said, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew they were out of options. Malcolm pointed to the engine thrust levers. "You're trying differential thrust for yaw control. It's not working because you're also fighting the trim. You need to zero the trim, use pure asymmetric thrust, and accept that you're flying with a massive lag time. Think of it like steering a ship, not an airplane." Captain Doyle made a split-second decision. She'd been flying for 20 years. She knew desperation when she felt it. "Take the left seat," she said to her first officer. "You," she pointed to Malcolm, "you have 90 seconds to prove you know what you're talking about." Malcolm slid into the first officer's seat. His hands moved across the controls, muscle memory overriding 5 years of absence. He adjusted the trim, eased the thrust levers into asymmetric configuration. The aircraft's descent slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. "There," he said quietly. "We're stable. For now." Behind him, Helen stood in the cockpit doorway, watching. Something flickered in her memory. A name. A file she'd seen months ago during the safety audit. Cohen. Pilot. Discharged. Incident report. She'd skimmed it, dismissed it as irrelevant to current operations. Now she looked at the man flying her aircraft, his face illuminated by instrument lights, his hand steady despite the tremor she'd noticed earlier, and she realized she was watching someone fighting demons she couldn't begin to understand. "We need to find somewhere to land," Captain Doyle said. "Grand Junction is too far. We won't make it." Malcolm scanned the terrain display. Mountains everywhere. Then he saw it. A long, straight section of highway, Interstate 70, running through a valley. Not ideal. Barely possible. But possible. "There," he said, pointing. "If we can maintain this descent rate, if we can control our approach with engine thrust alone, we might make it." Captain Doyle looked at the highway, looked at her instruments, looked at Malcolm. That's insane. In the cabin, passengers had fallen into a strange, suspended terror. Some prayed. Some held hands with strangers. Some simply stared out windows at the mountains rising to meet them. Helen returned to her seat, buckled in, and for the first time in years, felt utterly powerless. Everything she'd built, every decision she'd made, every sacrifice she'd offered at the altar of success, and she couldn't control this. But the man she'd fallen asleep against, the stranger with the worn backpack and grief-haunted eyes, he was up there trying to save them all. What she didn't yet know was that in approximately 7 minutes, she would discover the truth about who he was, about what had happened to his wife, about the decisions she'd made that had killed Helen Cohen. The highway stretched below them like a gray ribbon through hostile terrain. Malcolm's hands moved across the controls with mechanical precision, adjusting thrust, compensating for wind shear, calculating angles that existed only in the space between impossible and certain death. "Flaps are hydraulic," Captain Doyle said, her voice tight. "We have no way to increase drag or decrease landing speed. We're coming in hot." "I know," Malcolm replied. His eyes flicked to the airspeed indicator. 210 knots. For a highway landing, that was suicide. But they had no choice. In the cabin, flight attendants had taken their jump seats. The head attendant's voice, remarkably steady, came through the PA system. "Brace positions. Head down, stay down. Brace, brace, brace." Helen pressed her head against the seat in front of her, arms wrapped around her knees. Around her, other passengers assumed the crash position, a strange, choreographed surrender. She closed her eyes, thought about her mother, her sister, the life she'd sacrificed for ambition. All those nights working late, all those relationships abandoned, All those moments of ordinary human connection she'd traded for quarterly earnings and board approval. Malcolm's voice crackled through the PA system. He'd taken over communications. "This is the cockpit. We're executing an emergency landing on Interstate 70, approximately 90 seconds. Stay in brace position. Do not attempt to evacuate until the aircraft is completely stopped and you're instructed to do so." His voice was calm, eerily calm, the voice of someone who had faced death before and made peace with the possibility of losing. Altitude, 1,000 feet. The highway was filling the windscreen now. Malcolm could see individual cars, people pulling over, staring up in horror at the massive aircraft descending toward them. "Landing gear is hydraulic," the first officer said. "We have no gear." "Belly landing," Malcolm said. "We'll use the fuselage as a sled. The friction will slow us down." "Probably." "Probably," Captain Doyle repeated. Malcolm didn't answer. He was entirely focused now, every neuron firing, every sense heightened. This was the edge, the place where precision met chaos, where training met instinct. The place he'd lived during his military career and had been running from ever since. 500 feet. A car on the highway swerved wildly as the aircraft's shadow swept over it. Malcolm adjusted thrust. The nose was too high. He eased it down, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly. "We're not going to make it," the first officer whispered. "Yes," Malcolm said quietly. "We are." 200 feet. 100. The asphalt rushed up like a dark ocean. Malcolm cut the engines at the last possible moment. The aircraft dropped. The belly struck the highway with a sound like the world tearing in half. Metal screamed. Sparks erupted in a cascading wave. The fuselage shuddered, slid, scraped across asphalt in a grotesque imitation of landing. Inside, passengers were thrown against their restraints. Overhead, bins burst open. The smell of jet fuel and burning rubber filled the cabin. The aircraft slid for what felt like hours, but was only 43 seconds. Slowing. Slowing. And then, stillness. Absolute, shocking stillness. Malcolm sat frozen in the pilot's seat, hands still gripping controls that no longer controlled anything. Captain Doyle beside him was crying quietly. Whether from relief or shock, he couldn't tell. "Evacuate," Malcolm said, his voice hoarse. "Now. Fuel leak risk." The cabin erupted into controlled chaos. Exit doors opened. Slides deployed. Passengers scrambled out, some injured, most in shock, all alive. Helen pulled herself from her seat. Her hands were shaking. She moved toward an exit, then stopped, turned back. The cockpit door was open. She could see Malcolm still sitting there, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. She moved toward him. Around her, passengers were evacuating, but she couldn't leave. Not yet. "You saved us," she said from the doorway. Malcolm turned slowly. His face was gray. "Did I?" he asked quietly. Then, looking directly at her for the first time since the landing, "Tell me something. Helen Spencer. CEO. That's you, isn't it? I saw your ID earlier." Helen nodded, uncertain. Malcolm's voice was very quiet. 5 years ago, Flight 860, Skyward Airlines, Denver to Seattle. Do you remember it?" Helen's blood went cold. "The crash," she whispered. "We lost 47 people." 48, Malcolm corrected, his voice breaking. "You lost 48 people, including my wife, Helen Cohen." The cockpit seemed to tilt, though the aircraft was still. Helen gripped the doorframe. "I was VP of Operations then," she said, her voice barely audible. "I remember. The investigation said it was turbulence, pilot error. We paid the families. We improved our protocols." Malcolm stood slowly. "Did you read the full investigation? Or just the sanitized version your lawyers fed you?" He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded document, worn from years of handling. "This is the NTSB's supplemental report, the one released 14 months after the crash. the one that found counterfeit hydraulic parts in 12 Skyward aircraft, the same parts that failed on Flight 862. Helen took the document with trembling hands, scanned the pages. The words swam in her vision: counterfeit components, third-party supplier, approved by Operations Division, signature required, her signature. From 5 years ago when she'd been trying to cut costs, to prove herself, to climb the ladder. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know they were counterfeit. The supplier was certified. The paperwork was perfect," Malcolm finished bitterly. "I'm sure it was perfect. Just like the paperwork that said my wife's death was an accident. Just like the NDA your lawyers made me sign to get enough money to raise my daughter alone. Just like the discharge papers that said I was unfit to fly because I developed PTSD from the trauma of losing Ashlyn." He stepped closer. "Do you know what PTSD feels like? It feels like drowning, while everyone around you breathes normally. It feels like your heart is a bomb that could explode at any moment. It feels like the person you loved most in the world died because someone prioritized profit over safety, and there's nothing you can do about it." Helen's legs wouldn't hold her. She sat heavily in the jump seat. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "I am so deeply sorry. If I had known—" "But you didn't want to know," Malcolm said, his voice raw. "That's the problem. You cut the corners. You approved the contracts. You signed the paperwork. And when people died, you let your lawyers clean it up while you moved up the corporate ladder." He turned back to the windscreen, looking out at the passengers evacuating onto the highway, emergency vehicles arriving, the chaos of survival. "I couldn't fly after Ashlyn died," he said quietly. "Every time I got in a cockpit for mandatory recertification, I had panic attacks." Saw her face, heard her last voicemail. "The Air Force discharged me. Medical reasons. I became a maintenance worker at the airport, fixing the very planes I used to fly. I did it because I thought maybe I could keep them safe, keep others from losing what I lost." He laughed, the sound broken. "And today, the universe made me save a plane full of people flying on the airline that killed my wife. Made me save the woman who signed the order that put those parts on her aircraft." Helen stood slowly. Tears were streaming down her face, silent, unstoppable. "Malcolm," she said, "Captain Cohen, I don't have words for what you've done, what you've survived, what you just accomplished, but I need you to know something." She took a breath, steadying herself. "When I became CEO 3 weeks ago, I ordered a complete audit of all our suppliers. Every contractor, every parts manufacturer, every maintenance facility. I found irregularities. I didn't know what they meant yet, but I was investigating. That supplier, the one that killed your wife, they were already on my termination list. I was building a case to expose them, to make sure no other airline ever used them again." She pulled out her own phone, showed him files, emails, legal briefings. "I can't bring Ashlyn back. I can't undo my mistakes. But I was trying to make sure they never happened again." Malcolm looked at the documents, at her face, at the wreckage of the aircraft behind them. "Trying," he said softly, "is what we do when we can't fix what's already broken." They stood in the cockpit, 2 people connected by tragedy, separated by blame, united by the impossible act of survival. Outside, emergency personnel were helping passengers. Television crews were arriving. The story was already going viral. Miracle landing. Hero pilot. But inside the broken cockpit, no one felt like a hero. Only survivors. Of crashes. Of grief. Of decisions that couldn't be undone. And somehow, impossibly, they would have to find a way forward from here. The highway had become a makeshift triage center. Paramedics moved through the crowd. Most passengers had minor injuries, bruises, cuts, shock. 17 were hospitalized, 0 fatalities. The news was already calling it a miracle. Malcolm stood apart from the chaos, leaning against an ambulance, an emergency blanket draped over his shoulders, though he wasn't cold. A paramedic had checked him over, found him physically unharmed, and moved on to others who needed more immediate care. He watched the passengers, saw families reuniting, saw strangers embracing, saw the relief and gratitude pouring out of people who had believed they were going to die. He felt numb, not happy, not proud, just empty. Helen found him there an hour later. She'd been dealing with emergency response coordinators, media liaisons, federal investigators. Her blazer was torn. Her hair had escaped its bun. She looked more human than she had in years. "The NTSB wants to speak with you," she said, "and the FAA, and about 7 news networks." She paused. "Everyone wants to call you a hero." Malcolm didn't look at her. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who remembered how to fly." Helen sat down on the asphalt beside him. Not CEO now, just a person. "My lawyers are already preparing statements," she said quietly, "trying to control the narrative. But I'm not letting them. I'm going public with everything. The counterfeit parts, the investigation I'd begun, the failures and oversight that happened under my watch, even before I was CEO." Malcolm turned to her, surprised. "It's going to destroy the company's stock price," Helen continued. "The board will probably fire me. There will be lawsuits, criminal investigations. My career is over." She looked at him directly. "But your wife deserves the truth. All those families deserve the truth. And I'd rather lose everything than keep living with this hidden." Malcolm studied her face, saw genuine remorse, genuine courage. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was something. "Ashlyn used to say," he began slowly, "that the bravest thing a person can do is admit when they're wrong and try to do better." He paused. "She would have liked that you're telling the truth, even if it costs you everything." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun beginning to set over the mountains, painting the crash site in shades of gold and orange. "What happens now?" Helen asked. "To you, I mean." Malcolm looked at his hands, the same hands that had just landed an aircraft he'd sworn he'd never fly again. The same hands that had held his daughter when she cried for her mother. The same hands that had spent 5 years trying to fix broken things because he couldn't fix himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "The FAA will want me to recertify. Probably therapy, evaluations. It's not simple." "Would you want to?" Helen asked. "Fly again?" Malcolm thought about it, about the feeling of being in that cockpit, the terror, but also the rightness, the purpose. The knowledge that every skill he'd ever learned, every hour he'd trained, had converged in that moment to save lives. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but not for your airline." Helen nodded once, then disappeared into the crowd of officials. Malcolm pulled out his phone. It had survived the crash intact. He opened his photos, found the one of Ashlyn, taken 3 days before she died. She was laughing, her hair wild in the wind, her eyes full of life. He'd looked at this photo 10,000 times, but this time he let himself really see it. Not just the loss, the love. He typed a text to his daughter, staying with his sister during this trip. Something happened. I'm okay. Better than okay. I'll tell you everything when I get home. I love you. Dad." Then he looked at the aircraft, broken but intact, scattered across the highway like a monument to impossible things. He thought about Ashlyn, about Helen, about the passengers who would go home tonight to families who might never fully understand how close they'd come to losing everything. He thought about second chances, about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives prepare us for the most important ones, about how courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. And for the first time in 5 years, Malcolm Cohen allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to honor Ashlyn's memory, not by drowning in grief, but by living fully in the life she'd wanted for him. 6 months later, Malcolm would recertify as a commercial pilot, not with Skyward Airlines, which would undergo a complete restructuring after Helen's testimony exposed decades of safety violations, but with a smaller carrier that prioritized safety over profit. Helen would resign as CEO, but would spend the next 10 years as a safety consultant, helping airlines around the world implement the reforms she wished she'd championed earlier. She would never fly first class again, choosing instead to sit in the middle seat, row 3, as a reminder. And sometimes, on certain routes, she would find herself seated next to a pilot deadheading home, a man with storm-gray eyes and a daughter's drawing folded in his pocket. They would nod to each other, not quite friends, but connected by something deeper. Survivors of different kinds of crashes, both still learning how to fly. The story of Flight 429 would become legend. The miracle on Interstate 70. But for those who lived it, the real miracle wasn't the landing. It was what came after. The courage to face the truth, the strength to keep going, the grace to forgive, even when forgiveness seemed impossible. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come from avoiding the crash. Sometimes it comes from surviving it together and choosing, despite everything, to still believe in the possibility of flight. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button and share it with someone you want to hear with. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story.